I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
So welcome back to Dustbowl Diatribes, and today we have with us Rich Myrick, who just completed his dissertation, and he wrote some very interesting things that we want to talk about today concerning the early 20th century France and the politics that were going on at that time. As you all know, we have a particular interest in Peter Maurin as the one of the founders of the Catholic worker movement, and he was influenced by the movements that were going on in France at the time that Rich's dissertation covers, in particular Catholic social movements and political movements. So I thought first, before we start barraging you with questions, maybe we could ask you, Rich, if you could just tell people kind of who you are, why you wrote the dissertation when you did. I know you're a non-traditional student. You've got a whole career behind you already, and you're launching into this new space. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes. Well, first, thank you for inviting me. I'm really interested in this discussion from my point of view as well. I didn't know who Peter Maurin was until you contacted me about this, so it's been very interesting digging into that a bit. Yeah, as you said, I'm Rich Myrick. I'm originally from Texas, but I've moved about every 2 years my entire life. So that pretty much defines me. Originally, it was because my dad was an engineer, and we moved from job to job. And then once I got out of college, I joined the Marine Corps, which moves you a lot too. I finally settled down about 15 or so years ago to work for the federal government for the Marine Corps again. But one of the things that prompted me to leave all that, besides the fact that there's only so much manpower administration you can do in a lifetime, is that the Marine Corps was nice enough to send me to the Naval Postgraduate School for a master's degree in international relations. I studied Europe, Eastern Europe, and interdisciplinary field. It was very interesting to me. I enjoyed it very much. Economics, political science, cultural studies, language, those sorts of things. But the one aspect of the study there that was kind of hard for me to understand how it was generated was history. I know that sounds a little odd. History is very popular. I'm a consumer of history too. What I didn't get was how you actually did it. The methodology seemed so different from everything else. So when I got to the end of about 2019 or so, and I decided I was going to be done with federal service, what could I do? What did I want to study? And I'm interested in a lot of things, but I landed on history because I wanted to learn how to be a historian. I wanted to teach it. I wanted to write it. And I just wanted to research it and learn for myself. So that's how I ended up choosing to come to K-State. It was the right program, great people here, and was able to do that. So that's how I got involved with history. And I didn't have a degree in history before I started the PhD, which I don't advise. But it was a learning curve at first, but it definitely has paid off for me now.
Well, thanks. I thought it was very well written and engaging. So obviously you have the methods and everything down at this point, and I hope that you're able to find a publisher for it, because I think a lot of people would be interested in this, and probably in particular a lot of our listeners in the Catholic worker movement. So before we get started, though, like, what drew you in particular to this topic? Why this period of time? Why this this particular place and topic?
Well, I landed at this topic in this particular time and place, really coming from the outside in. I don't have a Catholic background. I'm not Catholic. I wasn't initially intending to do something like this. What I came to K-State to do is to study my proposal when I applied was that I was interested in counter-revolutions. And one of the major counter-revolutions I really wanted, it's really my top choice to study, was the Vendée Rebellion during the French Revolution, which was very much a Catholic-oriented. It was a pushback against the Republic by Catholics, mainly peasants. And I wanted to do something about that. When I got here and doing the reading that I was doing, I realized what really most interested me, although I'm still interested in doing something on the Vendée Rebellion, was politics and religion, church and state, beyond simply, one rebellion. And so in talking with my advisor and doing lots of reading about this, I landed in this time period, really the late 19th, early 20th century, Third Republican France, because it has it all. Everything was in play for these people. It was in such a flux, and Catholics, because we're really in France at this time, we're really just talking about Catholics. It was overwhelmingly Catholic. That was the religion that was being suppressed by the state for reasons that went back to the revolution itself. And just dealing with a hostile environment, how were some Catholics pushing back and just refusing to be involved at all with the Republic, the intransigents, but another group, a fairly large group, who were trying to find some way to maintain their faith and maintain Catholic traditions within a Republican or a liberal system, so to speak. And it just drew me because they're trying to bridge this. It's a polarized environment in this time period that we're talking about. You're either Republican or you're Catholic. You can't be both. I use the term Catholic Republican all throughout my dissertation. That would not be a term that you would have heard at the time, except in very, limited ways, because it was considered an oxymoron. In this polarized environment, you had Catholics who were saying, no, we can find a way to do this because we have to. There is such a thing as Catholic republicanism. There is such a thing as Christian democracy. And that was all happening at that time. So I was just drawn to it. And this one political party, Action Libérale Populaire, ALP, is the one that I ended up writing about because they were in the mix of it from a constitutional viewpoint, which was also an interest of mine. So that's how I ended up doing this. I didn't start that way. I think that's what most dissertations are like, though. You start with one thing and you end up with something else.
That's for sure. Yes, I remember that in my own experience. That was true. I never thought I would be writing about Thucydides and Hobbes. And then that kind of characterized the first 6 or 7 years of my career. So you may find yourself, if you publish this, being asked to continue to write about it, which you may or may not like to do. I would actually recommend, if you don't want to say no, but it's so interesting. I'm sure there's still room for more to be said, but for our listeners, could you kind of explain the Catholic context? Leo the 13th
right.
Was trying to make this move towards acceptance of republicanism and, taking more cognizance of the circumstances of working people in the new economy. And so maybe just tell us a little bit about what was going on with the church, with Leo, and his teachings that kind of inspired these people.
Right. Well, Leo the 13th is really the main character in all of this. He is behind all of it. He really is the one who launched these movements that I ended up studying. I don't know if he launched what they ended up being or was what he intended necessarily, but he is the main figure in this. And he became Pope in 1878. And when I look back after studying it, I realize he was laying the groundwork for the things that were to come later. By far, the most famous encyclical that he promulgated was Rerum Novarum, and that always comes up in this, as it should. And that's the one that addresses specifically labor, capital, how Catholics should approach industrial labor and ownership of businesses and these sorts of things. He deals with all kinds of things in that encyclical. It's still obviously quoted today. It's considered to be one of the origins of Catholic social teaching. It was added to by Pius XI in 40 years afterwards with, I'm going to mess up this name because my Catholic, my Latin's not good, but Quadragesimo Anno, which literally means 40 years later. Pius XI published another one. And this was the one that detailed things like solidarity and subsidiarity, all these things which are so central to Catholic social teaching now. This started with Leo the 13th, but in the context of the time, it was an earthquake. Now, obviously, he wasn't just speaking to a French audience. He's the Pope of all Catholics, but France was very definitely on his mind. So what I did when I started to study this, I was obviously Rerum Novarum was something I had to dig into, and I did. I went back. There were 3 encyclicals that he wrote before this, and I won't go into them in detail unless you want me to, but Immortale Dei, Libertas, and Sapientia Christianae. Each of them builds on the others with essentially somewhat of an updating of Thomas Aquinas, an updating of maybe older versions of how church and state operate together, essentially charting out a way that Catholics should think about and could then operate within the modern systems of parliamentary democracy. And the reason why that was so important in France is because, like I said, it was considered you couldn't be a Republican and Catholic. And by the way, both sides believed this. The Republicans didn't want confessional Catholics involved in their government either. So what happened next after Rerum Novarum, and I'm perfectly happy to talk about that if there's questions about Rerum Novarum, but for the purposes of my study, almost more important was the next encyclical. And this was one that was addressed specifically to the French episcopate, the leadership of French Catholicism. And this was written in French, and it has a French title, which is unusual for an encyclical from a pope. Au milieu de sollicitude. It just means in the midst of our concerns. And this was 1892. Rerum Novarum had been 1891, and 1892 was Au milieu. And by the way, I never thought I'd be reading through papal encyclicals at this level, but they are. I actually recommend to people, if they have the time and they would like to do so, to read through some of Leo's encyclicals. The official translations are in English. You don't have to read them in Latin. And he was a canon lawyer. He was a trained lawyer. He writes in a way that is very clear and that builds as if it was a legal argument. So it was very accessible to someone like me who doesn't have the kind of Catholic theological background. It was written in such a way that I think it's very understandable. The thing about Au milieu that was such an earthquake was that that's where he explicitly told French Catholics, you need to become part of the Republic. You can no longer hold out for a restored monarchy. It's essentially not going to happen. If Catholicism in France is going to survive and thrive, you must become not just accept the Republic, not just accept that it's here, but become an active part in it. Now, there were many Catholics who refused to do so. These are the intransigents I mentioned earlier. They just would not do this. They did not want to give up on monarchy. They considered monarchy, whatever form it was going to be in, was the only way that the church could thrive in France. It's the traditional Ancien Regime way. That's what they wanted to go back to. But the larger group of confessional Catholics, and remember, confessional Catholics were not the majority of Catholics in France at this point. 95% of people identified as Catholic, but we're probably talking 30 or 40% of the country were actually confessional Catholics. Still a lot of people, millions of people. But they were conflicted by this. But there were those who said, okay, we're going to give up on monarchism. We're going to try our best to find some way to work within the Republic. Now, what happened was, I'm sorry.
Could you real quick just clarify what distinguishes a confessional Catholic from, I guess, what we now call like a cultural Catholic?
That would actually be pretty much the same distinction, is someone who identifies as a Catholic. If you ask them, they're a Catholic, but they don't go to Mass. They're in church a few times in their life, and that's it. A confessional Catholic is a devout Catholic who believes, practices, and thinks along the lines. It would basically be the type of Catholic who is a true practicing Catholic.
Gotcha.
That would be the distinction. Thanks. I tend to gloss right over that, but that it's important because it's still a rather large number of people. It's not a like today in France, maybe 10% of people attend Mass regularly. It was much higher than that at that time. So what this meant was, how do you do that? There was no template for this. So I would divide it into about 3 different generalized groups that came up with ways to do this. And this is always one of the problems with French Catholics, maybe with everyone in France, frankly. You see it with across the board. Maybe it's around the world. They all go in different directions. And that caused a problem later for all of these groups because they weren't unified. But what happened was the first group, and this is the group that I studied, a relatively small group at the time. I refer to them as Catholic Republicans. I've already mentioned that wouldn't be a term they would have used. They were constitutional liberals. They were Catholics who believed that the way to protect religious freedom, as they actually termed it at the time, was to reform the Constitution. The Constitution of the Third Republic, and yes, we're on a Third Republic by the time we get to this. The first 2 hadn't ended so well. And in between, you had a couple of empires and other monarchies. The Third Republic didn't have a constitution. It had a set of constitutional laws that were passed in 1875. It didn't have a Bill of Rights. It didn't mandate a constitutional court by which whatever the legislature passed could be basically reviewed on its constitutionality. That idea wasn't even part of France. And it had a very weak executive. They didn't have any checks and balances. The Chamber of Deputies, which was the lower house of parliament at the time, it's now called the National Assembly again. They keep repeating things in France. Had all the power. If the Chamber of Deputies passed a law, you had enough deputies to vote for it. It's about 590 of them. If you got a law passed, that's the law of the land. There is no review. There is nothing else. So what these Catholic Republicans saw was that, number one, is highly unstable because every time you get a new regime in, they just pass a bunch of laws that counteract the last group. But also there's no way to protect anyone's rights because the rights aren't delineated. They're not actually written out. There had been, for instance, in the First Republic, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It's very clear. It's very famous. That was not part of the Third Republic. So basically, the legislature could do whatever they wanted. And so the fear was if enough Republicans, secularist, anti-Catholic Republicans got a hold of the Chamber of Deputies, things were going to be bad for Catholics. And that actually did eventually happen. So this first group was saying we need to reform the Constitution. We have to build enough political strength to control the chamber ourselves so that we can then pass laws that protect minority rights, constitutional rights, and all these other things. They didn't do so well in the 1890s. There weren't enough of them, and that does not appeal to people's emotions. What did appeal to people's emotions is the second group, who were, at the time they were referred to, and this is where the confusion comes in a lot of the time. I call them clerical Democrats. At the time, they were called Christian Democrats. So they used the same term that we would use now for a very different type of group. These were very motivated, very devout Catholics who, at the grassroots level, were followers of a series of, they were all over the country, of essentially local clerics, mainly parish priests, who developed a huge following, mainly in mainly Catholic areas like Brittany, places like that. They were known as the Abbé Démocrate, or the Democratic Abbots. And they were very influential, and they grew their followings very large, hundreds of thousands of people. So there was potential here. Their way of looking at things was not constitutional. They wanted to get as many Catholics like themselves elected to the Chamber of Deputies as possible, and then essentially form a Catholic republic. Now, this eventually was, Leo XIII put the kibosh on this in 1901 because it was getting out of control. A lot of unseemly elements were coming into this, a lot of anti-Semitism, things that were embarrassing to the church. It ended up going nowhere, but the impetus behind the movement remained, and it eventually helped later to fuel some of the I would call it, by the time you get to the interwar period, you're seeing elements of these groups that have sort of shed some of that negative stuff, and they are very important to the growth of Christian democracy as it grew after the First World War. But in this time period that I study, they ended up being more of a problem than anything else. And then there's the third group. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the third group is the one that I think would be most interesting to your audience, because this is the group that produced XIII. This is the group, and I should define that, because Le Sillon is absolutely correct. It is the title of the movement. In French, they would call it Le Sillon, or the furrow. But Le Sillon was also the name of the journal for which the movement was named. So in my work, and generally with Anglophone historians, we call it the journal Le Sillon, the movement Sillon, and the actual participants in it, Sillonistes. Dealing with French can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. But I'm sorry, you had a question?
No, it was actually going to be the lead up to that. The
Okay.
young Peter Maurin was involved in Sion. So
That's it. He ended up being part of that, although he wasn't in the beginning. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and get into a little bit about Sion, because I think they're the main focus here, and they're a very interesting group in their own right. Yes. Okay. I find them fascinating in their own right, and a lot of other people do too. You'll find a lot of work written about Sion. They're considered very influential to the movements later, well into the present. They're venerated by a lot of the people who still follow this sort of thing in France. I took a little bit different approach because I was looking at them in terms of how they worked alongside the group that I was studying. Nonetheless, they're very interesting in their own way. When you think about the fact that this was a movement which was actually started at we know exactly where it was. The journal was founded at the Collège Stanislas, which is a high school in Paris. These were 15, 16, 17-year-old boys who founded a journal that was motivated by social Catholicism in 1898. I'm sorry, 88. Yeah, 1888. I get those numbers wrong. By the time they were 21 and out of high school, and these were bourgeois kids, they were actually fairly well off, but they were motivated by social Catholicism, and I probably need to define that for you too. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause on Sion and go to social Catholicism. It is extremely important to all of these movements because, in a way, it's what Leo XIII was tapping into with Rerum Novarum. Social Catholicism, as defined in France, was not limited to France. In fact, there were very similar movements in Belgium, in Germany, and I'm sure in other places. But in France, it took the typical Gallican approach that they had their own version of this. It came out of the same concerns about the growth of industrial capitalism in the 1830s and 40s that you would have seen in other places. These huge factories that were being built, the destitution of the workers, poorly treated, all that sort of stuff, which was new to France. And prior to that, you would have had artisans that were kind of in that category. Now you have these workers, many of them in urban areas where none of them had been before. Urban areas are growing. These are the same stories you'll hear in a lot of different places. But in France, the reaction of Catholics was sort of some very motivated, but still monarchical Catholics who believed in the monarchy, that there needed to be a Catholic response to this. In other words, there was an obligation of practicing Catholics to do something for the workers. And there's several sort of the first ones to actually delineate this. Lamennais, Lacordaire, Ozanam, I think it's Francois Ozanam is probably the most famous outside of France because he's the founder of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which of course still exists today. Those are the types of movements that were founded. Now, to put it in context, this was during the constitutional monarchy is another one of the monarchies that was happening, 1830s and 40s in France. It wasn't a return to the ancien regime kind of monarchy. It was a liberal monarchy, yet you still had all these problems. I tell my students, picture Les Miserables. That took place during this time. So they get a picture for that kind of thing. So it actually developed into quite an interesting movement at the time, but it never spread that much because the July monarchy fell. There was a coup d'etat. The Second Republic was established. There was another coup d'etat 4 years later, and the Second Empire was established. This was what it was like being in France in the 19th century. I always tell my students, France has had 5 republics and 16 constitutions. So there's a lot of turbulence. So it went somewhat dormant until after the next turnover, which was the establishment of the Third Republic, when the Prussians, who became the Germans, invaded in the Franco-Prussian War. This was Bismarck and his plans to establish the German Empire. Massive defeat for the French, but it ended up ending the Second Empire of Napoleon III. So this is where the Third Republic came from, out of a war. And they lost the war, but they were able to build a republic out of it. So when that happened, many of these younger Catholics who'd been involved in that sort of thing, and one of them is one of the main figures in my dissertation, in my work, which is Albert de Man, who was a noble, his Count Albert de Man. But he had an epiphany, and there was several things that caused this, where he realized that as a Catholic, and he was a very devout Catholic, that he had an obligation to the poor and to workers. He had been exposed to some of the writings that had come out of the earlier period, and he rejuvenated the whole system. He developed a way of doing this, founding what became kind of the signature of French social Catholicism, which was the study circle. Again, not something completely new to France, but it just spread like wildfire across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people involved in this, where some patron, usually it could be a priest, it could be a noble, it could be a factory owner in some cases, would teach a circle of workers. It started with workers and then it expanded to others in Catholicism and in obligations to each other, and also just uplift, essentially. And this was the origins of very much a ground up sort of thing of social Catholicism. But because the Third Republic was developing towards a line of secularity, the Republicans who were in charge at that point started to push back a lot of this on this kind of thing and started to try to push Catholicism out of the public square. This is most exemplified by the Liege Clause, as they're called, which were passed in the 1880s, the early 1880s, that essentially attempted to cut Catholics off from the education system. It didn't work then, it worked some later. This was because there was no education system in France without the Catholic education system. The congregations, both male and female congregations, provided most of the teachers and most of the schools for French children. So the government itself, the Third Republic government, these were they technically were called the Jules Ferry laws because he was the prime minister at the time, mandated secular government-run education for all children in France. So this was the beginning of the pushback against Catholicism that was a surprise to many Catholics by this point. They had high hopes for the Third Republic. This also started to limit what was happening with social Catholicism because they were now being essentially hounded out of the education sphere. It didn't happen all at once, but it was a slow process. So this brings us back to Sion, because this is the environment in which by the time you get to the late 1880s, these young men who were educated in one of the few schools that was still operating in the Collège Stanislas decided they needed to do something about this. And they essentially joined this movement. But just at the time when they were doing this, getting into the early 1890s, is when Leo XIII was taking his move towards, Rerum Novarum in 91, and then Omniludis Solicitudes I talked about getting with the Republic in 92. So these very young men in their 20s, early 20s, decided this was the method that they were going to use. Now, what made Sion, they established study circles just like all the others. What made Sion different is that they equated democracy with Christianity and Christianity with democracy. Marc Saunier, who became the main leader, in fact, he was the leader of Sion going forward from really the middle of the 1890s on, was quoted many times as saying, democracy is the perfect expression of Christianity. So this was not an overtly political movement, but it had political ramifications. The other thing about Sion is that it was stridently, strongly localist. Saunier's focus was the parish priest, and it started with young men, and then eventually young women were involved too, at the parish level. He was not immediately distrustful or dismissive of the episcopate, but there was always an element with him that said that's not where the energy of the church is. The energy of the church is in the local Catholic in his local church, in his local parish, taking care of his local community. So it was very community-based. I think you can start to see why eventually someone like Peter Maurin would have been attracted to this. Now, when I did my background work on Peter Maurin, because I didn't quite know a whole lot about him, there's a couple things, and I'm actually answering a question without you asking it, but I'll go ahead and do it. Peter Maurin is, I know you all have studied him and looked at him from the work that he did with the Catholic Workers Movement in the United States, but his background is very interesting. I don't know how much you know about this. I can talk about it if you'd like.
So we've tried to figure this out over time, but
Okay.
it is kind of murky. And, there's only a few biographies of him, and he wrote very little himself. Right. So I think anything that you can add would be much appreciated.
Okay, I'm taking this from some of those sources, but also from what I know about these other movements and what I just know about France. The first thing that stood out to me about Peter Maurin was where he's from. He's from a little town, and you may know this, Auteuil, in the Lozère. What that means is he is from the farthest from anything place you could be in France. It is the least populated, at least the least densely populated part of France, and it is very rough country. That area is known generally in history as the Cevennes, if that rings a bell. It's the southern part of the Massif Central, so it's hot and it's rocky and it's dry and it's inhospitable. I couldn't imagine trying to farm in the Cevennes. It's rustically beautiful. If you ever go, I do suggest. But Lozère, which is the department where the town that he's from, he's actually the central city there, and it's just a little town because there are no big cities in Lozère, is Mende, where he actually went to school once, I believe he was 14 years old. So he had to go to another town to go to school. This area also was an area of refuge, and that's also, I think, important to understand about the background there. I think there are some connections you might be able to make with that. By that, I mean, this was the area that the Cathars tried to escape to during the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th and 14th, 5th centuries. This is an area that a lot of Protestants escaped into during those persecutions during the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries. So one of the things I read was that the town right next to his, just over the mountain, was a Protestant town, but they probably never had anything to do with each other because everything is so remote. So this would have been a very hard life in the beginning, but it makes very tough people. It makes for people who are very resourceful. And I don't want to, paint with too broad a brush, but I actually really like the people that I know from that area of France. It's not that I actually like French people. It took me a while to realize that I did, because I had prejudices before I started studying these folks, and I will admit to that. But the people in that area of the country just are very appealing. But it's rustic. Other people in France would call it a backwater. So here's the thing. He obviously showed promise, because when he went to school in Mende, and this was a school run by the De La Salle Christian Brothers, who were still able to operate at the time, And this would have been, I believe, if I charted it out right, sometime around 1890, something around there. And so remember, it's 1890. This is when all this other stuff is going on in the rest of France. But my guess is he wouldn't have either been aware or been affected by it because he is on the dark side of the moon. That all would have changed drastically when he was 16, when the Christian Brothers sent him to Paris. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for a young Peter Maurin to show up in Paris for the first time. It had to have been a culture shock. But he seems to have adapted very well. He did very well in the school there from all respects. He took his first 1-year vow and then another one and another one. Then he started taking his 3-year vows with the Christian Brothers and would teach. But you'll notice he didn't stay in one place very long. He moved to different schools all around Paris several times. I'm looking mainly at Mark Ellis's biography, which I think was pretty good about these early years. And so by the time he gets to, this would be the early 1900s, so about 1902, he's been with the Christian Brothers as a teacher, as a brother, for about 8 or 9 years. It's about 8 years if you actually add it up when he was actually teaching. And this is what I didn't see in the biographies, but what matches up with the things that I've studied. Why did he leave the Christian Brothers and join Sion? Well, here's my best estimate without having him attesting to this. The Christian Brothers were essentially run out of the country. He was out of a job. This is the time of the Radical Republic, which had started in 1902. Technically, the term that we use is the Bloc de Gauche, the left bloc. This was a group that was elected in response to some nationalist craziness, which had gone on, which I haven't talked about, but was not connected to all the Catholics per se, but it created a groundswell of support for the left. This group included everyone from the center left all the way over to the socialists and excluded anybody from the right, including most Catholics. And so this group had a mandate, because they won the election, to do exactly what Catholics had feared would happen. He began, meaning I refer to he as Emile Combes, Combes, who is the initial premier. The prime minister title didn't exist at the time. It was actually known as the president of the Council of Ministers, which is just too long. So we call him a premier. But he was in essence he was the most powerful person in France. And he was anti-Catholic. And he began within the first month of his tenure shutting down about 90% of the Catholic schools in France.
Wow.
Yeah. Why? Because he could. That's the way the laws worked. He used another set of laws in order to enforce this. But in a year later, he eventually, essentially, made it almost impossible for any of the congregations, these teaching congregations, to continue in France. This, by the way, is also when the Congregation of the Holy Cross moved to the United States. They had already established the College of Notre Dame years before. Some of these groups eventually did move back to France after this eased up in the interwar period, but it was touch and go. The only orders apparently that were, or groups that were allowed to stay, were those that had no chance of ever teaching. The Trappists always come up because vow of silence, there's no teaching congregation involved there. But it was a bad time for Catholics. Now, what that meant for my party, the ALP, was that they had a lot of very motivated Catholics who wanted to join with their effort. Sion was part of that. Sion initially, under Marc Saunier, actually aligned with ALP, this Catholic Republican Party, but eventually over time started to move away. So 1903, when Peter Maurin would have joined Sion, left the Christian Brothers because they essentially had to leave the country, he became part of Sion. This would have been a time when Sion was actually actively working with ALP. But within a couple of years, that changed. So these are the changes I think you're looking at. Why did Peter Maurin leave?
Yeah.
And I'm going to stop and let you redirect whatever questions you have about that. There's a lot going on here that affected why Maurin would have been involved and then why he would have left. And I'm more than happy to go into that.
Yeah, I guess, could you could you hone in specifically on in 1903, all of these laicizing laws have been passed. So like what were the shifting, basically like political contours between like the ALP, the
Right.
social Catholics and Sion, and like, because what you're laying out like in this moment, I think, is that they're kind of coming together in a coalition reacting to the new political reality. Is that right?
That's exactly right. ALP is the only one that was an actual political party. The answer to the trivia question is they were actually the first political party established in France. And there's reasons for that have to do with changes to how associations were formed. It gets into a lot of extraneous stuff that's probably not very interesting. But the point is they became the platform, which is, I think, what you're talking about for a lot of these Catholic groups. For instance, and this is one of the things I talk about in my work, Catholic women's groups actually joined with ALP. Now, the Catholic women did not, or any women at all, did not get the vote in France until 1944, one of the latest in Europe. So they didn't have the vote, but Catholic women were very, very motivated, and they gave legitimacy to the party that they otherwise wouldn't get, because these Catholic women's groups generally stayed away from politics. They considered politics to be dirty. So they decided, hey, things are getting bad. We need to help out. So they became basically ground troops for this party. They essentially doubled the size of ALP's worker party. It ended up having somewhere around 500,000 people involved with this party relatively quickly within a couple of years. Mm-hmm. Now, Sion actually didn't get involved in the party directly. Saunier would attend event. Marc Saunier is really the main player here. He is the leader of Sion, and he is a charismatic speaker. People gravitate towards him. He's one of these people that just sort of has that gift. And so he becomes, remember, he's in his 20s, and the leaders, I haven't really talked about this, the leaders of ALP are in their 60s. So there's a generational difference here, but they see so much promise in this young man who has created this movement seemingly out of nothing, with all these followers and all these study circles that are pushing back against some of this secularization which is going on. But they're in a very tough position politically, because the Bloc de Gauche, this left coalition, is pretty solidly in place by 1902. And the next elections are not till 1906. And a lot can happen in 4 years, and a lot does happen in 4 years. And so as things are moving along, I already mentioned the school closures, generally known as the schools crisis. And then a year later, there's the congregations crisis. Like I mentioned, that many of these congregations, essentially what it amounted to is the government took on itself the right to essentially license any group with more than 20 people in it. And if you were a religious congregation, they wouldn't license you. So you had no way to own property, to manage money. You had no way to actually operate within the country legally. So that's why so many of them had to leave. So this outright discrimination against Catholic groups was going on in France, ostensibly a Catholic country. The other thing that happened in 1903 that caused some problems for later, especially for Sion, was that Leo XIII died. He was 68 when he became pontiff, and so he actually lasted a lot longer than the people who put him in thought he would. But he was replaced by Pius X, who is kind of one of the name popes. Pius X was not as amenable to some of the liberal things. He was more like Leo's predecessor, Pius IX. He didn't immediately undo what Leo had done, but he was a little bit cooler to some of these efforts, like those with ALP. But he liked Sion, at least at first. So this was starting to change the way Marc Saunier was looking at his movement. In 1904, there was another crisis. This had to do with discrimination against Catholic officers in the military. There was actually a concerted effort. It's odd to me they actually got away with this as long as they did. They used Freemasons in local communities to spy on Catholic officers, and they would take notes on who went to Mass every week. That would get relayed to the war ministry, and when they came up for promotion, they would prevent their promotion. Not making this up. They would actually do this. They got caught doing that. That actually ended up causing the Combes government that had done a lot of the stuff to collapse. But he had already initiated the next big thing, which happened in 1905. So a lot could happen in 4 years. And that was the separation of church and state, the separations law, which formally separated church and state in France. And there's a whole history of what that meant. The Concordat of 1801, which was negotiated by Napoleon and the Pope at the time. I'm going to forget who it was. I think it was Pius VI. But what it essentially did was the government would no longer pay priest salaries. They wouldn't maintain ecclesiastical structures, these sorts of things. It formally separated church from state. And this was another motivating factor for Catholics, because there's just one more thing. Now, there were Catholics at the time who said this actually could be a good thing, because a government that doesn't like you running your affairs is not a good thing. And maybe you need to run things on your own. Eventually, many Catholics came to that conclusion later. But at the time, it was another motivating event. You think about this, if you're a confessional, devout Catholic, all you've seen for about 20 years is the government encroaching, and then basically discriminating against you. You're unable to participate in government. You can't hold a position in the ministry if you're Catholic. These were actually the laws of the land. So ALP is trying to push back against this, generate enough of a coalition. You mentioned a coalition. That's what they're trying to build, to essentially take control of the government and institute the constitutional reforms that would prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future. That's what they wanted to do. They didn't just want to wipe out these laws. They wanted to make it impossible for these types of laws to even be passed in the first place. But they lost in those elections. They didn't manage to get a majority. They did well, but not well enough. Mm-hmm. And that's where I see, when I look at the timeline, that's where Saunier kind of went off on his own. He had already sort of moved away from ALP a bit after the separations law passed in 1905. By 1906, he was moving in the direction of actually what would essentially be forming his own political party as its own competitor. He had purged, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask something before we moved on too much.
Yeah.
So the conventional wisdom is that Maurin eventually left Sion and moved out of France, actually, because Sion became more political and less personalist, and that he was more attracted to personalism. But it sounds to me like Sion never was non-political, that it was always, or from fairly early on, a movement, right?
I would define it slightly differently. I think I would dispute the, not that you're saying this, I know I've seen it in the historiography too, of personalism. I think Maurin definitely was attracted to personalism later, but personalism really wasn't developed at this time. I think what attracted him to Sion, from what I can see from what I know of him and what Sion was at the local level, was that it was a very effective way to sort of develop spiritual strength in these small groups. That was really the heart and soul. The problem with Sion, with Marc Saunier, in my mind, and there will be historians who would dispute this, because there's a lot of people who really like Saunier. In this time period, though, I believe it kind of went to his head, being in charge of an organization this big, basically moving with the movers and shakers, thinking he could do it better. And I think that's what eventually happened. I was about to mention in 1905, he was getting pushback from some of his executive leadership in this national organization. It's a localist organization, but now it has a national leadership. You think about some of the problems that can happen with that. And he purged that leadership because they were pushing back against where he was taking it, which was more political. They wanted it to remain a movement, a spiritual renewal movement that basically would build the country from the bottom up. Was kind of, that wasn't going to work fast enough for somebody like Saunier. So in 1905, like I said, he got rid of them and he brought in basically younger people who were completely on board with him. And I'm going to have to pull this because it's a quote. This was from people who left. They quoted that this is the way Saunier was portrayed by the people. It's a very short quote. Essentially two things. Marc is infallible And Marc alone embodies Sion. That's who he wanted in his organization. Now, this would have been by 1906 and 1907. So you can, I believe, see why Peter Maurin is starting to have doubts about this group. In 1907 is, I think, the big push. And that's because Saunier announced he was forming the Grand Sion, the great or greater Sion. And this is where he was moving away from the Catholic focus and wanting to open up this movement to non-Catholics, first Protestants, then Jews, then non-believers. So this was changing the nature of the movement. He was foregrounding democracy and sort of pushing Catholicism to the back. It was always there with him. He never lost his faith, but he was trying to change it into a movement that he believed could actually change the democratic nature of the country. Understand this about Sion towards the end and why it got the attention of the papacy was that Saunier was a big believer in democracy, political democracy, yes, but also economic democracy. That would be okay with social Catholics. Social democracy, that would be okay with social Catholics. Religious democracy, that is not okay with the papacy, especially with Pius X. So this was all going on at the time that Maurin was clearly making a decision about whether or not this was something that he needed to stay with. He didn't leave Sion, Sion left him, or that's the way I would portray it. He was not with the group that long, but 6 years is a good while. But I think by the time you get to 1908, things have gone completely sideways in terms of why someone like Peter Maurin would be attracted to that. Definitely, like I said, I don't think it was a personalist element, but if that was ever anything like that was ever part of Sion, it was starting to go away. So this had become a centralized, almost dictatorial organization that was on the verge of becoming a political party. And that's what got the attention of the Vatican. There are other things involved. Sion was a target for monarchists, nationalist monarchists like Charles Maurras's Action Française. There were a lot of people who didn't like him for other reasons. He had developed a very large organization that threatened their recruiting within Catholicism. But the main reason why Pius X issued the encyclical, and it was our apostolic mandate. I couldn't remember during the final exam what the name of it was, but that was in August of 1910, where Pius X issued this encyclical to the episcopate in France that condemned Sion's teachings. To his credit, Saunier dissolved Sion the next day, and it never came back. He went on to do some really interesting things. By this time, Maurin was gone. But Saunier laid low for a bit, and then he reestablished a youth league that was oriented just towards social welfare. After the war, he became a very, very strident pacifist and internationalist. He didn't join the Christian Democratic parties during the interwar years for whatever reasons. I'm not quite sure. I think he distanced himself from politics for a while. He was in the Chamber of Deputies briefly in the early part of the 1920s with just one of the standard center-right parties. After the war, meaning World War II, he became really, he was given an honorary presidency of the first and really the only ever truly widespread Christian Democratic Party in France. This is the MRP, the Popular Republican Movement in English translation. And he actually served as a deputy of that party until his death in 1950. Saunier is considered to be one of the founders of Christian democracy in France because of Sion. I think sometimes it's despite what Sion ended up as being. So many of the young men and women who were involved with Sion in this period, even up to the point where they might have been disaffected with it, nonetheless began to grasp that Christian democracy could actually be a thing, it could work. And so when they became politicians of their own, many of them did in the 1920s and 30s, they interjected some of those same ideas into the movements that were established after First World War. So I think it's absolutely correct to place him at the forefront of Christian democracy in France. But this period in Sion, I don't think that would be something that I would want to highlight on my CV. As for Maurin, I think that was probably the major push. I can't see why that wouldn't be. There's another element, and I'll just say briefly, it's very clear that Maurin from the beginning was not all that interested in the military. He actually did his military service and until he didn't. And I think it's another reason why he left the country. But the point is, Saunier actually established, remember, he was a pacifist after the war. He established what was known at the time as the Jeune Garde, the Young Guard. This is in like 1901, 1902. These were younger members of Sion, late teens, early 20s. And they wore uniforms. They drilled and marched in the streets, and they actually got involved in things like street brawls. He used them as basically security when he would do speaking engagements, because socialists sometimes tried to disrupt his speaking engagements. So I don't think that would have gone over very well with Peter Maurin either. There were things about Sion that probably always would have maybe not quite sat right with him. But I think in the end, it was Grand Sion, the idea of changing it from a Catholic movement to strictly a grassroots democratic movement, that would have made him think, this is not what I need to be involved in. And oh, by the way, I will also say, because I haven't talked about it enough, social Catholicism was very much oriented towards workers, and Grand Sion was moving away from that to something more political and less about the economic injustices that they would have been noting before. That's probably another issue there.
It is. Before we get out of this, I wanted to make sure we talked about Leon Harmel as well.
Right.
Peter Maurin wrote some easy essays about him. So can you characterize where he was in this swirl of social Catholicism?
Yes, he was one of the earliest, not just founders, but practitioners of social Catholicism. He was in many ways, along with Albert Dumas, the count I mentioned was part of ALP. Leon Harmel was the face of social Catholicism in France for quite a while. Now, the difference with him was that he was part of a family that owned factories in the north of France, near Roubaix, a place called Val de Bois. And he on his own, as a young man, his father was still alive, but they were all on board with this. This would have been in the 1870s, late 1870s, early 1880s, decided to basically form his own version of a Christian corporation. So although this wouldn't qualify as, say, Christian anarchism, it had some elements of that. The difference would be that he maintained control as the patron, as the patriarch of this. But he instituted all kinds of things which were not actually instituted by the government in France for quite some time, as far as worker pay, benefits, pensions, all these things on his own as part of his Christian corporation. It became a model for others in France. Not enough of them imitated it, but it was a pushback against the idea that industrial capitalism, or really industry, had to be exploitative of workers. Now, what's interesting about Harmel is that he became a confidant of Leo XIII. He made pilgrimages within France and then eventually to Rome on a regular basis, taking thousands of workers with him. This became a regular thing. What ended up sort of changing things with Harmel, and this would have been about the time that Sion was being formed, is that would have been about the time of the Ralliement. I didn't actually mention the Ralliement. When we say Ralliement, we're referring to that movement that was started by Leo XIII, that idea of rallying Catholics to the Republic. So I just glossed right over that, but that's a very important term to use for this time period. Harmel was part of that, but Harmel decided to go in not with ALP, and Sion really wasn't its own thing yet. He actually went in with the Abbé Democlat. That ended up being a problem because he completely lost control of them. As I said, they went off in many different directions. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. So he ended up distancing himself from politics in the latter part of the 1890s and never really got involved again. He continued to do the pilgrimages. He continued to do them, I think, all the way up until 1911 or 12 when he died. He was still doing these. And he was actually still advising Saunier. It's well known that he consoled Saunier and advised him what to do next after the papal condemnation. This is a man who was well senior of Saunier. Saunier very much respected him. I can't say that Sion was formed around the model that Armel was putting out, but Armel was the first, this is before really anybody else did this, to decide that even his model, this is actually before Leo the 13th came out with Rerum Novarum, Leo the 13th, that Catholic trade unions needed to be established. This was actually counter to a lot of the social Catholic ideas that of sort of a corporatist view of things, where management and labor would all work together and be part of the same team. Armel was actually saying, no, I think Christian workers, because of the Catholic workers, because of the nature of what they're up against, need to form their own unions, but they need to be Catholic unions, not secular trade unions or socialist-oriented unions. So he was very important in establishing that. In fact, those movements still exist in France today, Catholic trade unions. So that's where he came in. He was as much a mentor to Saunier and therefore Sion as anything else. But I don't see direct connections to what Saunier was eventually trying to do. It's actually somewhat counter, I think, to what Armel would have wanted to do. Armel never got himself directly involved in politics, never ran for office. He could have won, but he never did. By the way, all of the others did. Jacques Pue, who was one of the founders of ALP, Albert Dumas was long-term member of the Chamber of Deputies, and eventually even Saunier, but Armel never did.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, you tell first a story from your dissertation, and then I want to comment. You tell a story about how Armel was leading a pilgrimage, and this was before the ALP coalition building was happening. Both Armel and Damon would lead pilgrimages, and Damon had this orderly procession happening. And then Armel's troop comes out of like a forest with like a brass band and drums, and like Damon, the aristocrat, is scandalized because this is all like bourgeois gaucheness. And then his other partner in the ALP, Jacques Payot or something like that.
This is earlier than that. You're getting the story right, but it was actually the person who was basically telling Dumas to back off was René Latour de Pin, who was his original partner in social Catholicism. This is before Dumas ever had anything to do with Dumas. By the way, it's one of my favorite stories. That's why I put it in there. I had to find a way to get it in there.
Well, and it symbolizes this kind of rapprochement between the social Catholic entrepreneur and this aristocrat. And you talk about how with it's Leo the 13th, part of the Ralliement was a shift from more, again, my French pronunciation is awful, syndicate mixte versus syndicate separari. Can you talk about
what? Yeah, that's a fancy French way of saying the change from the corporatist view where management and labor do everything together to a trade union approach. The mixed is meaning that the labor and the syndicat mixed means that labor and management are working together directly. The problem with that, the problem that Armel eventually saw with that, and frankly Leo the 13th saw with that, was that it's always going to be imbalanced. And so both Leo and Armel started to push for these Catholic trade unions, and that's the syndicat séparé. It just means separate groups, not in conflict with each other, but looking after interest in a different way. So that's where that came from. And Armel got there long before, say, Albert Dumas did. Albert Dumas resisted it. His model, going back to his original models, those cercles, was that he kind of liked being the one who led the groups, I think is a lot of it. He really liked working with, talking to workers and stuff, but he kind of liked being the one in charge. Armel was willing to give that up because at some point he believed the workers had to stand on their own 2 feet. And Leo the 13th also was pushing that. That's what, in many ways, made Rerum Novarum so different from anything that had come before. And there's many other things in Rerum Novarum. It's very long and cyclical. Again, I do recommend it, if you haven't done so, to read it. It isn't exactly sometimes the way it's portrayed. People tend to cherry pick things from it. You have to read it as a piece. But that's one of the main. In fact, I think he spends more time, me and Leo, more time talking about Catholic trade unions than anything else in Rerum Novarum. That really is the focus.
So before we wrap this up, can you, I guess, share any further thoughts or insights you have on Peter Maurin's career, especially as he leaves Sion? And then also, can you kind of wrap up where your dissertation wraps up with? We've talked about like the lead up to forming the ALP and all these adjacent movements. What happens after electorally?
Well, yeah. Sure. Well, first, as far as Maurin, I still am learning, but especially from where he came from and the challenges that he faced all along the way, even after he got to North America, it went on for quite a while. It's remarkable to me that he maintained a lot of these lessons which he'd learned as a young man. I found it interesting. I'll put it this way. Sillon means the furrow, and Saunier used the metaphor often enough that it's sometimes translated as the path. I think he meant, and the meaning is the furrow. He referred to plowing a furrow and planting seeds. So he used this agricultural metaphor. This is coming from a young man who probably never saw a farm and never worked on a farm. And yet you have Peter Maurin, who rejected what Sillon was doing in the end, who knew very much what it was like to work on a farm and knew very much what it was like to be a worker. And I think, to me, when I read about Peter Maurin, what separated him from a lot of these other groups, not that they didn't mean well, they definitely did. They didn't know what it meant to be a worker. They didn't know what it meant to be that. And when I see that combined with, and understandably, I understand he had a period of time when he was not much of a practicing Catholic, but he came back, and that he was able to combine these things, I think, is what makes it interesting to me. Now, there's a whole nother discussion about personalism, obviously, and Meunier and many of these other people. But I like the frankness and I don't mean this in a negative way, the simplicity of the way Peter Maurin is approaching this. I did find the one quote in the Ellis, actually, I was reading from his dissertation, not the book, where he quotes Maurin from 1941 about Sillon. And I think this kind of sums up a lot of what we were talking about. In the dissertation, it's page 40. I'm sure this is reprinted in the book. But this is like the one quote that apparently there is about Sillon. You may have seen this. Sillon was...
In the book, it's probably page 29.
Okay. So you know the quote I'm talking about. I think to be able to see that and to see through that tells you something about where his motivations were.
Well, real quick, would you mind reading it for people?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. I see. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I should do that because you got listeners. This is the quote in English. Sillon was full of enthusiasm and generosity, but lacked deep thought. It allowed itself to present democracy as the only political regime in conformity with Christianity. It was condemned for the preceding reason, as well as imprudence in thought and language. That's about as good of a synopsis as I've seen of where Sillon went wrong. And again, there's a lot of fans of Sillon who wouldn't like me saying that, but I'm just calling it like it is as a historian. So, and I'd be perfectly happy. I know we're getting short on time, but to talk about more and more. But as far as wrapping up with my dissertation, I ended it, the most of it. I talk about some things in the conclusion with World War I, and basically, finally, the idea that Catholics were going to be accepted within a coalition that was basically run by secularists. And this is a long road from where they were just a few years before. The war put a hold on everything. Politics froze. After the war, this is when Jacques Pugh, who is the one you mentioned, he was the president of ALP from beginning to end. He was the real driving force. He was the true constitutional liberal, I would say. He was the one who decided that ALP was needed to merge with one of the other parties to form what he termed a Tory party. He had a British view of what that party could be, again, with the goal of constitutional reform. And the problem for him was that didn't happen during his lifetime. He died in 1932. The Tory party that he helped establish, they didn't call themselves a Tory party, it was the Republican Federation, ended up splintering into other things in a very French way and never passed any sort of constitutional reform. And as he would have predicted, even beyond 1932 when he died, there was more turbulence in France. And we end up with the mess that was the 1930s, with all kinds of things going in different directions, the collapse of France, the fall of France in 1942, the Nazi regime, the collaborationist Vichy, and then the Fourth Republic, which de Gaulle himself, who had helped to start, rejected because it created a constitution that looked very much like what the Third Republic had had. That ended up with a coup, or an attempted coup in 1958. But if you look at the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, which is the one which is still in force today, 65 years, that's a long time for a republic in France. That Constitution includes a constitutional court, a strong presidency to balance the Chamber of Deputies, as they call it, the National Assembly now, and a form of a Bill of Rights. It's ironic to me, and I love the ironies of French history. The Bill of Rights, as it kind of is in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, is essentially the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which was the Bill of Rights of the First Republic in 1791. That's before they went off the rails with the terror. So things do repeat themselves. My point about ALP is that they didn't achieve electoral success the way they wanted to, but they established the idea that constitutional reform was necessary in order to protect individual and group rights in France. They weren't the only ones saying this, and they weren't the only ones saying this by the time we get to the interwar year, but they were the first ones to say it, and they actually formed a political party to try to do this. Now, whether or not that's actually succeeded, that's another question. But in terms of getting that into the French body politic, that's why I believe that they were actually successful, even though they're usually portrayed as being unsuccessful. And there's other issues that have to do with Christian democracy in France. It's in a very weak state today. None of the major parties in France would align themselves as Christian Democrats. In fact, none of them are particularly Catholic, whether they be Macron's party, whatever he's calling, they're called the Ralliement again now, certainly Le Pen's party, or La France Insoumise, which is the sort of the leftist version of a populist party. None of them have a Catholic focus. So in some ways, the secularists won in France, but the French are having lots of problems with this now, and it's recognized, certainly in the current time, that there is a place for this that maybe there wasn't recognized as such in the past. There's a lot of things that I could go into about the Fifth Republic and de Gaulle, which I'll spare you that. De Gaulle is actually emblematic of this, though, because he was a devout Catholic. He took Mass every day in the Élysée Palace. It was scandalous to some of the other Republicans at the time, but he never talked about his Catholicism in public, and he never enforced it in any way. He never did anything like what these Catholic Republicans would have done if they were in that position. It's ironic that the man who actually is the one who put together all these rights and passed laws that allowed Catholic schools to return to France in full measure in 1959 is Michel Debré, who was the one who wrote the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, who was a Catholic convert. He had grown up a Jew, and he was a Catholic convert in about 1940. He fought in the war, and he became a convert during the war. And he actually reintroduced Catholic schools to France, which they are there now. And so some of these things have been restored, but the movement itself of Christian democracy is not strong in France the way it is in other countries in Europe.
Well, we have run out of time, I think, but man, there's a lot left to talk about.
Yeah, there is.
Like we should ask you to come back. Well, I'll have to try to persuade you to come back.
I would like to. Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about specifically with Christian democracy, but it gives me also a chance to read up a little more on Peter Maurin so I can maybe target some of those things.
It's
later.
fantastic because anything that we can do to kind of historically situate Maurin and just learn more about these political movements, in a way they're so different from the way people think now that it's informative, right? So we really appreciate how much work you've put into this and your time, and it's good to hear that you probably will say yes if I twist your arm. So I appreciate that as well. So
No,
thanks.
I'd definitely be happy to come back, and thanks again for inviting